For the chapters about life cycle rituals, which include both the bar and bat mitzvah and the wedding ceremony, we talked a lot about how there are so many factors that we might want to think about as being either influential on the ritual, but also a part of how we as scholars determine when to kind of count the ritual as having started and where does it take place. So, with both of these examples, I think we see that we have statehood being really important, as well as what we would call transnationalism. The idea that Jewishness is a kind of community that crosses national boundaries. So, with the bar and bat mitzvah, we have examples of people who left the Soviet Union and moved to the United States. And those chapters, as you may have noticed, or those examples, I'm sorry, as you may have noticed, are all from the late 1980s, so just before the Soviet Union ended. The other chapter looks at how American practices in Reform and Conservative Judaism have influenced life in Israel in terms of creating a ketubah, which is the marriage contract and is really the central piece of a Jewish wedding. That's when the wedding happens. So I think with both, we see that there are these social contexts that are different with different geographies, but that the legal issues are also really important and have a huge influence on what Jews are able to do and what kind of systems they're negotiating. So in addition to that, transnationalism, we thought a lot about how these are ethnography. Ethnography is really the category that's kind of most associated with cultural anthropology. That is to say, it's sometimes defined as participant observation, but it means that someone would go and be a part of a community, right? That this whole book is based really on thinking about ethnography, or at least doing kind of ethnographic history, thinking about how people really live and not just a kind of abstract history or only looking at text. Because in this case, we don't necessarily have texts. We have the ketubah, but that might not tell us everything we want to know. And then with a bar and bat mitzvah, these are very late practices. So the bat mitzvah is the latest. The first bat mitzvah was in the US in the 19 teens. But really, bat mitzvahs didn't begin to be incorporated into Jewish ritual until the 50s and 60s, basically when there was a social movement for more gender equality. Other traditions in conservative Judaism, it's often a confirmation ceremony. Sometimes, for many people, it's both. Then confirmation comes maybe when children are at the end of high school, kind of about to become really what we might think of as adults, not just adults in terms of halakha. But the bat mitzvah, so the bat mitzvah is a 20th century innovation, but the bar mitzvah is a 13th, 14th century that it begins to really exist at all, which is to say, it's not halakhic, so it's not rabbinic. It comes much later. And that's one of the reasons why it's sort of interesting that the bat mitzvah is very controversial, because it's not a halakhic ceremony, right? So there's nothing really being violated there. On the other hand, the issue is, what would people really be initiated into? That the idea of a bar bat mitzvah is that the child is now fully responsible for halakha. This might apply to both boys and girls, but it's also the first time that they would come to the bima, the platform in the synagogue where people would go up to read from the Torah and other activities during synagogue. and the child chants a Haftorah portion as is discussed. And those are not things that girls or women can do in Orthodox Judaism. So sometimes people have a kind of ceremony for girls when they're 12, but it would not be one where they are initiated into the same kinds of halakhic practices as boys. So it's not a halakhic ritual, but it is one with a posture toward halakha. I think the last kind of big thing that I want to talk about is really just when and where does ritual take place? Is it only the 10 to 20 minutes that someone is performing a ceremony? Maybe it's an hour, whatever. Or do we see it as much longer? Does it start 6 months earlier when their parents start to call restaurants and rabbis? What are the kinds of decisions that people make? How are they different when it's a life cycle ritual, which is to say, it may be something that only happens once. A child is born, and so you would have a life cycle ritual. Generally, people have some kind of traditions around that. Then there's some kind of coming of age ritual that here in Judaism we have the bar and bat mitzvah, a wedding, having children, and then dying, right? That those would be the big life cycle rituals. So maybe someone gets married more than once in their life, but usually they're not already planning on that when they're having this wedding, whichever this one is. Even if it's not the first, they think it might be the last. Right, but and so these take on a different kind of importance for being that kind of one-time event. And then I think that that's brought into even greater relief when we look at this example, say, of Soviet Jews who are, it's maybe the first ceremony that anyone in the family has publicly participated in as a Jew. So whatever kind of secular or maybe secretly sort of practicing Jew they were in the Soviet Union, they have a totally different set of possibilities in the United States. But this isn't to say that they want to take on the same kind of Jewishness as other Jewish Americans. So they may not want to participate in Orthodoxy at all. I think that the comment from someone too of saying, look, I don't go to synagogue, it would not be sincere to hold my kids bar bat mitzvah in the synagogue. That's not who we are, right? That we can see there are lots of other Jewish spaces that are not necessarily synagogues. We see people really questioning what kind of Jews are we in our family? What kind of relationship do we have with Jewishness in the U.S., including with the rabbis? And I think that we can imagine then that the rabbis are making really important decisions too. Do rabbis want to say that they won't perform a bar bat mitzvah like would happen in a restaurant? Certainly many might say that. But that would mean to then push these people out of Judaism, right? Or out of the community anyway. Because it's probably not a choice between a synagogue bar mitzvah and a restaurant bar mitzvah. But, the restaurant or nothing. And so if rabbis really want to fold these Jews in and to meet them where they are, understanding their experiences, or at least recognizing that they've had totally different experiences from Jews in the United States or even Western Europe, that's a big choice for rabbis too, right? So we see a lot of different questions that come up. This chapter on weddings didn't talk about the questions that would come up around weddings in Israel that would be LGBTQ, that would be between a Jew and a non-Jew, especially if that non-Jew is Palestinian, all those kinds of things. So I think that there are a lot of questions left unanswered, and yet I think there's a way of beginning to think about how people negotiate that and how people use ritual to address questions for the first time. in their lives, or not necessarily for the first time, but it comes to a head in these kinds of rituals. And then they are a public performance, not only of the child or not only of the couple, but for the parents and the family and the friends and the synagogue community, the other religious communities, the secular friends, the, all of those kinds of things. So we see a lot of different factors at play, and that these chapters train us to think about how we can kind of zoom out when we even understand a ritual to have taken place, to understand where and how we think rituals can take place, and that we can also look at the ketubah as an example of a text that reveals a lot of things about practice, right? And so we can see a connection between text, things we might read, and then other ways that people live. So the last thing I wanted to do in thinking about some of the negotiations, it's buried in a footnote, so that's why I want to make sure that everyone saw it, that on page 118 of the Ramon chapter on tradition and innovation, she talks about, in footnote 10, she talks about what Jews would have to do, Jewish Israelis would have to do if they did not want to have an Orthodox wedding. So she tells us, Israelis who do not wish to have an Orthodox rabbi officiate at their wedding have 3 legal options. They can travel to another country, in most cases to Cyprus. So if you go to Google Maps or move to your mental map, Cyprus is very close to Israel in the Mediterranean. It's an island. They could sign papers of civil marriage in Paraguay through a lawyer in Israel. There's a procedure that costs almost as much as traveling to Cyprus, right? So in both cases, effectively, people are getting married in another country. It's just that simply there's a kind of possibility to register a marriage in Paraguay without having to physically be there. Or they could sign a contract not recognized by the state of Israel as a civil marriage, which nevertheless allows the couple to receive some of the financial benefits that married people enjoy. So we see there's a lot of different complicated factors in thinking about rituals in general, and also life cycle rituals in particular, because they are this kind of heightened sense of this being one-time moment, sense of a huge transition in life and change, that the ritual is a way to both negotiate that change, but also to make assertions about what the continuities will be, what the values will be, things like that.